Welcome to Lecture 1 on the Renaissance. We'll be looking at a time period here from about the 1350s to the 1530s, roughly a 200-year period. Some of the key themes that you'll look at in this class will be 1, nominalism, 2, humanism, 3, the rise of individualism, and next, the dawning of nation-states, and also the recovery of a synthesis of classical culture. Some of the key texts that we'll look at in this lecture will be Pico de Mirandola's Oration on the Dignity of Man and Niccolo Machiavelli's The Prince. Let's look at the cultural background. To understand the Renaissance, you have to kind of go back to the period before, and we're going to look at the end of the Crusades. The Crusades are a period that run from about 1095 up to 1291. They were called by Pope Urban II in 1095 as a response to the Islamic invasions of the 7th century. Those Islamic invasions had taken away roughly a third of Christendom and had locked Western Europe into a kind of deep freeze on the east side, coming up through Asia Minor, and all the way over on the west side in Spain. And so these Islamic invasions shut Western Europe off for quite some time and kind of locked it into a deep freeze. The Crusades, starting in 1095, ended really in dismal failure. And they're notorious for being a very dark time. But there are some things that came out of the Dark Ages and out of the Crusades that opened up Europe to a new age that will give birth to the Renaissance. One, it greatly diminishes the ranks of the nobility and causes a kind of a decentralized feudalism to wane. This is going to weaken the Roman Catholic Church, which at that time was kind of like a universal organization that will have a pope, but soon this pope will be exiled in Rome. Okay, so one of the things that's going on here is that as the old feudal nobility dies off, there's less and less of a kind of a social structure there. You had the lords, then you had the knights, and then the serfs. This is a feudalistic type of economy and a feudalistic social structure. And so there was a patchwork of many different kingdoms all over the place. The Roman Catholic Church during the Dark Ages served as kind of like a universal organization that held Western Europe together and kind of gave it a kind of universal culture at that time. But the Crusades are going to kill off most of the nobility. And the ones that aren't killed off are going to be greatly impoverished, and they're going to lose their land and estate and so forth and so on. The third thing that's going to happen is that a new economy is going to open up at the end of the Crusades. And it's not going to be based on land and feudalism, but it will be based on trade. So this new economy that emerges, a mercantilist economy, is going to create a new form of wealth. Back in the feudalistic age, in the Dark Ages, you needed land to make money. You needed land to have wealth. Land was required to have money. But now, at the end of the Crusades, or in 1291, there's going to be great ability to sail around the known world at that time and engage in a lot of trade. And so a lot of goods will be flowing into Europe, and a kind of the beginning stages of capitalism are going to emerge. So a new type of wealth is going to emerge. This is going to fuel a race to dominate the globe via colonial trade and mercantilism. Now, we're still a good ways off from that. Of course, 15th century with Columbus and Vasco da Gama. But still, there's an urge to get out around the world and find new trade routes because vast amounts of wealth could be obtained through this. The fifth thing is we're going to see a new middle class begins to gel, and the papacy will be weakened in the aftermath of this. As this new middle class emerges, they have new wealth. They are going to seek to use their wealth to do something that most people do once they gain some money, and that's to make themselves better, to educate themselves. And so one of the things that will emerge in the Renaissance period is this drive, this culture to educate oneself and to develop oneself, okay? And then last, we're going to see all of this is going to enable the rise of sovereign nation states. Nation states are a kind of a new political idea focused on a new socioeconomic dynamic. In the age of empires, the Holy Roman Empire, the Roman Empire going further back, even back before that, ancient empires are a completely different type of political order. A nation state is a new concept, and it's going to be forged through wars. It's going to be forged with this new middle class that has money, and the kings and queens of Europe are going to emerge during the Renaissance who want to be sovereign over a very defined piece of land, such as England or France or Spain. Those are some of the first big nation states. Okay? We'll see that it's against this cultural backdrop that Machiavelli will write The Prince, which is a political how-to guide or kind of a self-help book for rising monarchs in the age of the nation states. Dante's sublime synthesis of the Greco-Roman culture and the Judeo-Christian culture is something that we also have to remember. Dante, writing around 1300, his great Divina Commedia is a work of great synthesis. It's taking four great cultures, the Judeo-Christian culture and the Greco-Roman culture, and fusing them together in a magnificent literary work. And so he is going to be looking back to classical culture. And so it's in this cultural synthesis of these four major cultural influences that he'll write his magnificent work. His work criticized much of the corruption of the Roman Catholic Church at the time as well. There was rife corruption in the church because the church had essentially become not just a religious institution, but had become a political institution. And so much of the corruption that's in the church is open for criticism. There are many, many different attempts to reform the church at this time, and most of them all failed. We could run through them, but we'll do that more in the Protestant Reformation period. But Dante is also criticizing a lot of the corruption in the church. And so Dante is kind of the foreshadowing of the coming Renaissance. And its intentional reach back into the deep ancient classical culture. Now, another thing that we need to understand at this time is scholasticism. Simultaneous with this fusion of the cultures, Greco-Roman culture and Judeo-Christian culture, we'll see the emergence of scholasticism. But scholasticism will meet its angel of death in William of Occam, the great teacher of nominalism. Now, what was scholasticism? Let's talk about that. Scholasticism was a rediscovery of lost Aristotelian works, and they were infused into a new educational institution at that time called the university. So let's run with a short overview of scholasticism so we can understand the Renaissance. First of all, you had realism, scholastic realism. Scholastic realism held that universal ideas are real. In fact, they're the most real. They're the only thing, really, that exist, except for God. God produces these Platonic ideas, these Platonic forms. In an Aristotelian sense, they're going to exist only in the things in this world. Aristotle held that only the things in this world held the forms, whereas realists held that they existed outside of this world. And so you have two different competing schools. You have the full-blown realist, and then you have the conceptual realists, these Aristotelians. Now, why was this such a big deal right before the Renaissance? Because, again, at the end of the Crusades, something had taken place, or towards the end. There was an infusion of Aristotelian knowledge into the West. Now, it's Greek thought, it's classical Greek thought. Where had it come from? It had come from, or had come through, Averroists or Islamic philosophers. The Muslims had recovered Greek Aristotelian wisdom and knowledge long before the West did. And so they were responsible for transferring it as a kind of a conduit to the West. And so then Aristotle's works were recovered just at the same time that the university is emerging. Now, why is that significant? Because Aristotle is like a university in a box, okay? Aristotle is this genius of the ancient Greek world who had explored many, many different areas of knowledge. In fact, if you went to the university today and you looked at all the major departments in the university and tracked them back to their origins, a lot of them would track back to Aristotle. He was a master of botany, he was a master of logic, he was a master of rhetoric, he was a master of logic, of metaphysics, of physics, and I could go on and on and on. In fact, we only have a third of his writings, so 2/3 of his writings were lost. But this Aristotelian influx of knowledge into the West was explosive, and it fueled these new universities. And so there's now a crisis created within the old scholastic world of realism, and that is, how are we going to integrate all this new knowledge into Christianity, into the Christian world of scholastic realism? And so they began to compete with each other. And the great thinker here who is going to synthesize Aristotelian thought with Christian thought will be Thomas Aquinas. And his great synthesis project is an attempt to reconcile, if you will, synchronize and syncretize Christianity, Christian theology, with this Aristotelian corpus of knowledge, Aristotelian rationalism. But a long debate began to run and finally drive itself into ground. And this was between those who held that the Aristotelian ideas were better than the old Platonic realistic ideas. And so the basic issue was this: do universals exist independently of things, or do universals exist only in things? So the realists said that the real world is not even here. This is just a projection of the real world, the world of ideas. Whereas the Aristotelians held that this is the real world. You can see this very easily in the famous painting by Raphael, School of Athens, I'm sure you've seen before, where the two great philosophers are walking down the middle of the school. And Plato is walking there and he's pointing up, and he's holding a book in his hand, Timaeus. And Aristotle is walking alongside him and they're talking, and Aristotle is pointing down with his hand like this, with his fingers down, and he's holding a book in his hand, the Ethics. Now, what Raphael is trying to illustrate for us there, and he does quite effectively, is that these two different thinkers with their gestures and their books are demonstrating to us, and also by their very position in this whole School of Athens, their very position is showing us that these are the two central figures in the whole history of ideas. Well, reality is up there for Plato. In the Timaeus, which was the main Platonic work that Christians had throughout the medieval era, basically spells out a whole cosmology where the ideas come from the good, some eternal source of reality. Aristotle is saying, no, knowledge is down here with all these many things that we see in this world. This world is the world that's important, all these people around us. And he's holding ethics, and he's saying this shows us the right way to live. We should pursue virtue, and we should look at this world around us. So these are the two different debates going on. Enter into this long-running debate over the universals and the particulars. Which one is the center of reality? Enter into this debate a man named William of Occam. Nominalism is his school of thought. Nominalism has a very grave and a very enduring solution. He's also known for his famous Occams Razor. Now, what this school of thought will basically say is that, look, universals are only names for things. That's it. There is no universal either out there in some Platonic heaven, nor is there any kind of universal embodied in things around us. There is no universal. The universal is simply a convention, a sound, a word that we use to represent things. And so this is going to have profound consequences for Western civilization. It's a necessary precursor to modernity, and it is going to have deep, deep implications running all the way down to our present day. The ultimate kind of significance is this: nothing is what it is. It only is what we say it is. The only nature that something has is the nature that we give it by the categories that we put it in with the words that we have. Okay. So we will see more about Occam in nominalism. Now, what is Occam's Razor? You've probably heard of Occam's Razor, and you've probably heard people refer to it in many different contexts. Essentially, Occam's Razor says, do not unnecessarily complicate things. It's also called the law of parsimony. But the idea here is that the simplest solution is the best. Let me see if I can give you an illustration. Let's suppose I give you a mathematical equation to solve. And one student does it in 20 steps and gets the right answer, and another student does it in 3 steps and gets the right answer. Who has the best solution? Right, the one with 3. The simplest solution is the best. And Occam held that his nominalism was the simplest solution to the problem of universals. Another thing we need to consider is for the backdrop of the Renaissance is the Black Plague. Now, the Black Plague occurs from 1348 to 1350. A third of Europe died, and while this was a very dark time, it had the consequence of rising the cost of labor. The cost of labor skyrocketed, creating a very wealthy middle class. This is one of the things that benefits, or at least fuels, the middle class. This middle class now of laborers could almost, charge whatever they wanted for their labor. And so that wasn't what anyone intended, but that was just one of the economic consequences of 1/3 of the people dying in Europe. But people wanted social mobility. Back in the feudalistic age, no one had no one had social mobility. In other words, if you were born as a serf, your children are going to be serfs, and your grandchildren are going to be serfs. If you were born as a knight, then your children are going to be knights, and so forth and so on. You see the idea. No one could move between their social classes in the medieval period. The only out was to become a monk, really, or enter into the priesthood. That was the only way. But that came at great cost, obviously. But many of these middle classes have an urge to escape their old feudalistic class of serfdom.